Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another one of my Game of Thrones videos. So it is probably about time we look into and break down the possible reasons why Tyrion seemed pretty upset with Dany and Jon Snow getting together. Now I've got 5 possible scenarios on my mind here, or you can call them possible reasons, 4 of which I've already listed in response to so many comments on my previous videos. But the 5th scenario, now that one actually seems like an Easter egg hidden in plain sight on the penultimate episode of Season 7. Do bear in mind though that these 5 scenarios or reasons are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I'll be circling back to that later on. So for the time being, let's get started on listing and discussing those 5 scenarios I speak of. Number 5. Now this one is the least likely scenario in my opinion, but there's always the slightest chance Tyrion knows Jon is a Targaryen, and knows that once the incest bomb is dropped, it might cause a whole lot of trouble. It is actually pretty clear the show had Jon and Dany sleep together prior to them getting to Winterfell for a reason. It is all to create that one big complication. It just felt like this whole speech about the people of the North being comfortable seeing her arrive to Winterfell with him, like they are equals in a manner of speaking, was all to lead up to that very scene. Now I do realize how obvious that was, but like it or not, this is made for TV, and some things will always be done in a manner that serves the dramatic effect. But besides that, it did actually make some kind of sense as well. It would definitely show a more humble, woman of the people kind of side to Daenerys, especially when it comes to the man the people of the North have sort of elected as king in the North at the very end of Season 6. But once more, it is the least likely scenario simply because Tyrion knowing he's a Targaryen is a bit far-fetched. But then again, Tyrion has Varys, the Master of Whispers, who could have possibly known all along. But moving on to number 4. What if Tyrion betrayed Daenerys and sold his soul to the evil queen of the 7 kingdoms? There's a fairly good reason why I made this the second least likely scenario, yet a decent reason why it could hold true. It's an indisputable fact that Tyrion most definitely hates Cersei's guts, but it's also indisputable that he did love her children. He did love those children of hers a whole lot. Even when it came down to the cruel asshole that Joffrey was, he still loved him and did a great job being his hand, even though he was clearly disgusted by his actions and mannerisms. But we are also missing a decent chunk of time in his conversation with Cersei on the finale, pretty much the time that followed him realizing she was pregnant. So there's solid reasoning here to believe he could have ended up switching sides. There's also the fact that most of his conversations with Dany over the course of Season 7 have always ended with her disagreement with him, and in a manner of speaking, her dismissal of his opinion. At some point as well early on in the 7 seasons run, she actually sort of accused him or hinted at him being in league with his people, wanting to save his family. Now I'm not necessarily saying Daenerys' sharp tongue is a good enough reason for him to switch sides. I mean, Cersei has a sharper tongue. But if you combine that with the fact that Cersei is pregnant, it becomes fuel that adds to the fire. But you've actually got to admit it. It would be kind of ironic if Tyrion switched to Cersei's side around the very same time that Jaime abandoned her. But then again, this could actually be the show's way to throw us off, make us think one thing while it's a totally different situation. I'm guessing it's just way too obvious the way they faded out of that conversation scene. It just makes me want to completely discard this option. But we are almost halfway through, and number 3. What if Tyrion was actually in love with Dany? There might have been an Easter egg or two hinting at this possibility. During the events of episode 6 and in their conversation about succession, he seemed pretty keen on finding out if Dany had any interest in Jon Snow. He started off by making his statements in what seemed like sarcasm mixed with mockery of Dany's words, mixed with possibly trying to find out if she had feelings for the guy. He specifically repeated her words verbatim, including and stressing on, "and this Jon Snow." It would make sense as well because every man who's known Daenerys Targaryen closely so far has pretty much fallen in love with her. Think Jorah Mormont, a man who was originally assigned to kill her, but instead fell head over heels in love with her. Now the second Easter egg was right there on the finale, with the conversation he had with Cersei, where she sort of compared Dany to Shae. I shouldn't be surprised, I suppose. She's your kind of woman. A foreign whore who doesn't know her place. But finally though, and this is not necessarily an Easter egg, but more of an interpretation of his body language as he walked away after he watched Jon go into Dany's room. His face might read a bit of anger, but his walk totally read one of two things. He was either disappointed or just sad and heartbroken. So the chance does always exist he does harbor feelings for Daenerys. But moving on to Number 2. This one is fairly simple and pretty straightforward. Tyrion could just be fearful of the consequences of Dany and Jon's relationship not working out. I mean, they're two adults after all, and what is common to all adults whose relationships fail? They just get all awkward, all weird around one another when they have to be around one another, because otherwise, they're just trying to avoid being in the same place. They also get childish and very petty over broken up relationships. And just because they are on Game of Thrones, the Mother of Dragons and the King in the North are not necessarily exceptions to these kind of rules. But finally, the one I haven't mentioned before, and number 1. Now, people switch jobs for so many reasons: finances, career advancement, respect, better environment, and a lot more. One of the most commonly asked questions in job interviews happens to be, where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? So the first question I'm going to pose here in return is, where does Tyrion see himself in whatever number of years, possibly once Daenerys is gone? Other questions include, what did Tyrion find in the company of Dany so far that he's found nowhere else? And what would the loss of any of the things he's found mean to him? When it comes to the second question, I'm thinking he found respect, recognition, and a precisely accurate evaluation of his own political wits. After all, those political wits and the fact that they share a vision are what led Daenerys into making Tyrion Hand of the Queen. Besides that, prior to escaping his imprisonment, running off to Essos and ending up in Dany's service, Tyrion has always been screwed over by his very own family. His father's always treated him like he's some sort of toxic waste, like he's nothing, giving him shit left and right. And even when he did make him acting hand of the king to Joffrey, and even when Tyrion proved successful defeating and repelling Stannis Baratheon at the Battle of the Blackwater, he was stripped of his power and demoted to Master of Coin. And soon after, he was framed for Joffrey's murder, only to escape to find out his father took his girl Shae for himself. So being by Dany's side has most definitely quenched his thirst for that kind of respect and recognition that he's always looked for. But what does any of this have to do with Tyrion being upset and unhappy with Jon and Dany pretty much doing it? Well, it's really simple, and it was all right there on episode 6. So remember that scene where Tyrion has this conversation with Dany over succession? Now this scene, for starters, and as I mentioned on my most recent video, hints towards Dany probably having a child come season 8, or at least getting pregnant. But it might not just hint at that, or at Tyrion wanting a new political system and ruling hierarchy where the best for the people rules. It could also imply that Tyrion thought if the concept of succession was to be fully approved by Dany, he would be next in line. After all, if he wasn't the best in her opinion, she would have never made him her second in command. Let's look at the facts though. Daenerys does not have a child, and along with Tyrion, they both are under the impression she couldn't and will never be able to. Tyrion starts discussing succession and succession plans in the penultimate episode, seemingly insisting on going deeper into that conversation, if not for her ending it, and in a very abrupt manner. But even when she does end it, she does sort of promise him this conversation will be open for discussion later on, once they've taken the 7 kingdoms and everything she has in mind is pretty much in place. But on the other hand, Dany has been clearly attracted to Jon Snow for a while now. Her belief in him has been growing exponentially. And with all her disagreements with Tyrion, she seems to have been listening to Jon more and more with every passing episode. And if I were in Tyrion's place, I think, with this relationship being ignited, Jon Snow would probably end up being her successor, to be possibly followed by one Stark or the other. And after all he's been through, Tyrion might feel like he's not supposed to live the rest of his life as the second in command, like he's smart enough to deserve his place at the head of the table. At some point down the road, of course. They do say power corrupts, but so does the possibility or the ambition of having it. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, these 5 are not all necessarily mutually exclusive, yet some of them could be. So Tyrion here could be in love with Dany, yet fearful of the alliance between her and Jon Snow being ruined. He might also be in this case expecting she might end up reciprocating such feelings, and maybe he could then end up being her successor. Or he could be in love with Dany, jealous of Jon Snow, while feeling guilty over his newly found alliance with Cersei, because there's always the possibility a kid of his sister's trumps his love for all else. Pretty much what I'm trying to say here is you could mix them up to make your own theory on the subject, but I just don't think as of now that look he had on his face was the product of anything but one of these 5 reasons. But do feel free to prove me wrong and suggest other possible reasons in the comments. And if you couldn't find any and you believe it is one of these 5, let me know which one or a mix of 2 or more do you think it is that brought that look to his face. Let me know as well if you liked this video by slapping it a much appreciated like, and while you're at it, you could always subscribe and enable notifications. But until I see you next time, thank you all for watching and have a great day.